Welcome to the Touch MBA Admissions Podcast. Do you need help figuring out which schools to apply to or how to get into the world's top MBA programs? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others on this podcast and on our site, touchmba.com, as they seek the admissions edge. And now, here's your host, Darren Joe.
Welcome everyone to the Touch MBA podcast. This is your host, Darren, and we have a really special guest on today's show. James Clark went to the London Business School and graduated from their MBA program this year in 2013. And the reason I'm talking to James is because he wrote a great blog post for the London Business School student blog titled, "What I Wish I Had Known When Choosing Business Schools." And I think here at Touch MBA, we're all about helping you figure out what is the best school that fits you, that you should apply to. And so I think it'd be really great to get a student perspective of someone who went through that whole process himself, went to a top school, and now is kind of reflecting back on the choice he made and the questions he maybe should have asked when he was researching schools. So James, thank you for your time and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Darren. Pleased to be on the show.
Awesome. So James, could you tell us a bit more about yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started working as a lawyer in New Zealand what feels like ages ago. And I worked as a lawyer in New Zealand for about 3.5 years, doing a lot of M&A work, working in the oil and gas industry as well, or for clients in the oil and gas industry. Then I decided at some stage, no, the law wasn't for me. It wasn't a long-term career path, and I wanted to do something else, more business-focused. And I then moved over to London and worked at GlaxoSmithKline, or GSK, for a year. And I was working on Sensodyne toothpaste as kind of the major thing I was doing.
It's my toothpaste of choice.
Excellent. But I wasn't working as a lawyer. I was actually working as a project manager, and so did that for a year. And while I was over here in London, one of my friends was applying to MBA schools, and it really got me thinking, hey, this is probably the next step for me as well. And so I went through the application process, applied to a number of schools, and got into London Business School. And so that really led me to taking that next step in my career, and had a fantastic time there, and have just started working at PayPal here in London 3 weeks ago. So a whole new career trajectory for me.
Does your new job at PayPal, was it a switch for you in terms of function or role?
Yeah, very much a switch in function and role. Previously I was working as a lawyer and then as a project manager. And now really what I'm looking at doing is looking at strategy for PayPal in the UK and trying to identify new opportunities for them, and really trying to assess whether they're ones that PayPal should pursue. Are they going to be profitable? Are they going to be exciting and really grow the business? So yeah, it's definitely a change from what I was doing previously.
That's awesome. You have the ideal story for an MBA applicant, someone who wanted to boost or change their careers, and you were able to successfully do so. I know you're only 3 weeks into the job, but I think that's absolutely fantastic. So my first question to you, James, is why did you write this post of what I wish I had known when choosing business schools?
Yeah, well, so I got to the end of the MBA and realized that having been through one of the top business schools, you suddenly have, and it doesn't need to be a top business school, any business school, you really get an insight into the way it functions. What are the really nuanced differences about it that you don't really appreciate when you're on the outside? And I remembered when I was applying to business schools, it was always the same questions that I was asking, and everyone else that was applying was asking, like, they're asking, well, where is it in the rankings? Thinking about, well, where is the school located? And it was all very, I guess, kind of superficial. And it was only after being at London Business School for 2 years, I realized that there's a whole number of little things that really differentiate schools. And it's very hard often to tell what those are. if you're actually not within them and not had that opportunity to experience it.
So how did you go about your school research process?
Well, I think my school research process was pretty similar to what most people did. So I looked at the rankings and probably picked out kind of the top 10 schools and thought, well, great, here's a list of 10 schools. I'm going to apply to 8 of them. Then quickly realized, oh, that's 8, that's going to be how much in admission fees to apply for them, and how many referees am I going to need, and how many essays. So I realized I needed to narrow it down. And I did that, I guess, in 2 ways. The first one was I thought about, well, where do I want to be located? Well, in fact, actually, the first decision I made is that I wanted to do a 2-year program, given I was changing location, changing function. There was so much change happening that I thought 2 years was best. So that knocked out a lot of the European schools. But still, there were quite a lot to choose from. So I thought about location, and originally I was thinking I was going to go from M&A law to being working in an investment bank, and I thought, there's a great story there. And so that led me to apply to the East Coast schools in the US and to London Business School as well. And also the way that I narrowed down this was often going to the talks that admissions staff organise in London. And I was still kind of overwhelmed by the choices. And often I was just sitting in there going, well, do I feel a connection with the alumni that are speaking? And if I didn't, then I struck that school off my list. And I knew that wasn't the best way to do it. The people that were speaking weren't truly going to be representative of that school. But at that stage, I really didn't know any other way to narrow the schools down from the list that I had.
Yeah, so I think a lot of MBA candidates have that feeling of, just like you said, being overwhelmed. Even you targeting top 10 ranked schools, that is still a very overwhelming process. And how do you figure out which school best fits you? So your post, you list a number of questions under academics, clubs, extracurriculars, jobs, and other questions that you could possibly ask students and alumni. But my first question to you is tactical. In other words, clearly you think you should talk to students or alumni of the program.
Absolutely.
So that's the best way to really learn about a program, is to talk to someone who has gone through it firsthand. Now, the tactical question I have for you is, what is the best way to actually meet these students and alumni and get their time and get them to share their experience?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that there is no one best way. There's in fact there's probably a dozen different strategies that you can go about using. I'll list some of those. The first one is, well, have a look on LinkedIn and see whether anyone through your networks has been to one of those schools. Look at your undergraduate university. And I was talking to someone who's applying to London Business School this morning, and they got in touch with me through their old tutor at account when they were studying accounting at their undergraduate university. So there's those links. The other one is, think about, well, is anyone in your current job a graduate of an MBA program? You might not necessarily know that there is someone, but my suggestion would be is that if you seriously are thinking about doing an MBA and you can't find out if there is someone who has been to that school, then reach out to the admissions team and ask, this is my background. These are the reasons why I'm thinking of doing my MBA. Is there anyone that you can put me in touch with from a similar experience who might be at my current job, or who might be in where I'm living? So if I had been back in New Zealand when I was applying, I know that they would have put me in touch with a couple of people from a similar background who had been lawyers previously. So definitely reach out to the admissions team for that as well. Another way is, often these the business schools have clubs, and if you look on the club websites, you'll see that they'll usually have the presidents or members of that, and so reach out to those people and just sort of start up a dialogue and find out more about that. And if you happen to be in the same city, see if you can meet them for a coffee chat. So those are a couple of ways. I'm sure I could go on for quite some time, but it's really just identifying different avenues. Look on LinkedIn, think about all your different networks, whether it's your undergraduate school, your current company, reaching out to the admissions team, or just directly reaching out to current students.
Some awesome tips there. And I can say, speaking from the admissions perspective, that the one way that student club presidents or admissions officers won't help you is if you write them an email and say, I want to talk to someone who's studying at LBS or studying at SMU where I used to work. Because there's no context to that request. So when you try to contact student club presidents or students or alumni or even the admissions office, tell them about yourself. Tell them where you're coming from, what you're looking to do, and where you're from, and if you can be put in touch with students and alumni. So always provide some context to your request. Never make blind requests. So now maybe, James, if we can go straight into the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of this podcast, which is your list of questions. So again, you broke these questions down into academics, clubs, extracurriculars, jobs, and others. If we could start with some of the key academic questions you think students should ask when they're applying to business school.
Yeah, good question. I'm trying to think which are the most important ones.
Yeah, your academic section is the longest, so you have the most questions in there.
Probably talking about particular subject areas, and then also kind of like unique requirements. I think those are probably good questions to ask about there. Or maybe also how electives are allocated, and maybe good professors, I think. Good professors or particular courses that you want to do. I think those are probably the interesting ones that I would go. So definitely the unique requirements. Let's discuss that. And maybe like how electives are allocated and which ones you want to think about doing, and the good professors.
So yeah, let's take a step back. You
Yep.
at the time were in law and you thought you might want to jump into investment banking,
Yep.
right? At the time you were applying. So I'm sure that career goal influenced the questions you were asking to students and alumni. Or did it not?
I think a lot of my questions were probably more focused around lawyers making the jump into investment banking.
Yes.
And sort of, is this a school that is going to be able to enable that jump?
So I think that's a great perspective. So yeah, keep the bigger picture in mind about whether
Okay.
the school, right, can help you transition careers overall, not just academically.
Right, yeah.
You mentioned the requirements. Can you explain what you mean by academic requirements?
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of different elements to that. Some schools will say, right, here's the courses that you must do during your first year, and maybe even in the second year. And others will say, well, actually, we know that you want to all go in different tangents, and therefore we're giving you more options in terms of what you do. So some schools set very particular requirements about the courses that you need to do. And that was probably applies across all of the MBA programs out there. Then there are other schools that have particular requirements. And so LBS and INSEAD are two that have a language requirement, whereas I don't think many others do have that. And so that's definitely something to keep in mind and find out about. Are there any unique requirements that the MBA program you're thinking about have that you would need to meet? And is that something you want to do, or is that going to distract you from your other goals that you want to achieve during the MBA? And so, for instance, that was one of the reasons why I was really excited to apply to London Business School, is that I knew that it would be an opportunity to learn another language. And I knew that I could apply and to another school and learn it in my own time. But realistically, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do that. So yeah, I chose London Business School, and part of the reason for that was that I was be able to learn Mandarin. And for me, coming from New Zealand, knowing that at some stage in my career I would probably move back to that Asian area, then I thought, well, Mandarin would be an incredibly useful language to learn, and probably something I wouldn't do somewhere else.
That's great. So the first thing is to know the sort of bare bones or skeleton of the curriculum. How many core courses are there? How much flexibility do you have with those core courses? How long do those core courses take in the total time frame of your studies? What other requirements are there besides classes? Is there a certain project or thesis you have to do? Is there a language requirement, as James said? So get to know the bare bones skeleton of the academic curriculum. Now, another important question you said was, what is the school good at? Okay, in terms of concentration or subject area. Now, LBS, obviously, they have a great reputation for finance, but how would you actually go about finding that out? How can you tell that one school is stronger in one discipline than another?
Schools have reputations for certain things, or at least some, yeah, they all do. And I think there's probably elements of truth to all those images of what those schools stand for. The best way to find out is really go and ask those alumni or students and find out, well, is this true? And what is the reason behind that? Is it because those schools traditionally supply students to various paths? So, for instance, if you're at Haas or Stanford, my impression is they're going to be very entrepreneurial focused because they've got so many students heading into startups and tech companies. And so there's definitely a lot of courses associated with that. And if you're looking at your East Coast schools or London Business School, a lot of it is very finance focused because that's where they are sending people. And so a good way of really confirming that is talking to current students and alumni, see whether the courses that were offered at those schools enabled them to make the jump into the companies that they wanted to do, especially if they were not coming from that background. If you're from an investment banking background, and that's what you want to do afterwards, yeah, you're going to be able to jump into that wherever you're coming from. But if you're coming from a different background, so for instance, for me, from law, is London Business School going to be able to offer those courses that make that jump? Or if I wanted to get into the tech industry, is Haas or Stanford going to be able to offer those courses that allow me to do that? And I guess implicitly, I mean, mentioning those schools and those focuses, I would say that those are good examples of schools that are able to achieve that.
That is just absolute gold. So look at the macro picture in terms of where schools are placing their students. What industries do most of students go into? That's one place to start. Then take a micro perspective and ask students, do the courses offered by this MBA program, will they help a career switcher like me get into those industries? And I would say, and I think you would agree, what other extracurricular activities are there that would help me learn more about this industry or switch into this industry as well? So I wanted to get to your last question that you thought was very important, which was, how are electives allocated?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's an important thing to think about, especially if there are courses that you're very in. If you've done your research and you know that there are particular courses being offered, whether it's because it's on a subject focus that you really want to do, or because it's taught by a fantastic professor who you would really like to study under, you need to know whether you're going to be able to do those courses. And every school offers the selection of courses in a slightly different way. Most of them offer some sort of bidding system where you get given a certain number of points and you then need to use that to kind of bid for those courses. And once your points are gone, that's it, and you can't use them up for other things. But then at London Business School, there's a different method where you rank the courses, and which I guess in some ways is still, you need to think of your strategy of, well, what are you going to rank and in which order? But it's still an element that you need to decide, is that going to mean that maybe you're not able to do the courses that you want? Maybe it means that you prioritize a particular course that you do want to do, but maybe you end up missing out on something that you do want to do. The best way to find out whether you're able to get on the courses that you want is, I would say again, is just talk to alumni, talk to current students and find out how challenging it has been getting on those courses. I would also say, I guess in the vast majority, at least of my experience and talking to other people, generally people do get on the courses that they want to get on. And I think, MBA schools try and allow students to get the choices that they want. But definitely be aware of how schools are making those decisions to make sure that you do get the courses you want.
How important is it to figure out whether how many people are there in your stream or section or cohort? How do people interact with each other? Are there study groups? Do they matter? Can you talk a little bit about the size of the class and how you interact with your classmates?
Every school does it differently. Well, at the same time, everyone has a sort of similar variation, I think, where you have a cohort or a stream or a section where there are, 60 to 90 students, and you're with those people for a lot of your core courses, and you get to know those people particularly well. I think it's something that's quite hard to research because it changes so often from year to year. You might find some people think their cohort is the best thing since sliced bread. I love my cohort, and I think we had something particularly special. We got on fantastically. So it's something that's really hard to quantify and measure. But I guess it is a good question to ask to schools, like, well, how do they allocate them? And so, for instance, at LBS, what they tried to do is we had 5 cohorts, and they tried to create, I guess, like a mini version of the United Nations, where they would try and represent different countries equally across all the different cohorts. So, for instance, there were 5 New Zealanders at LBS, and there was one in each of the 5 streams. They also try and mix up the backgrounds as well, so it's not all the lawyers in one stream. Instead, they're kind of spread over all the different streams. And that means you get a whole bunch of different personalities from different countries, and also different experiences as well from different industry backgrounds and different roles. And so that also plays into the study groups. And I think most MBA programs also have study groups as well, which is a kind of group of, let's say, 7 students where you'll work on projects together to varying degrees. And I think this is an interesting thing to find out between different MBA programs. So for London Business School, for some of our core courses, there would be, I don't know, let's say up to maybe a third of our grade would be assignments that we do as a group. Whereas I know at other MBA schools, the study group is really just something where you've placed in there to discuss just the business case that you'll then be discussing in class. But there's no group grade that will come out of that. I liked the idea that there was a group grade assigned to the study group, because then there's more incentive to work, well, you have to work together, and I think that's a great thing where you're thrown in with people who you might not necessarily get along with, but now you have to, and it's a great way to learn how to interact with people from different cultures and improve your leadership style in a safe place. You're not there in a workplace where you're going to get reprimanded for doing something wrong. Here's an opportunity at business school to try something different.
So I think this is another great way to sort of examine the skeleton of the program. So not just the curriculum, but how your interactions are structured in terms of the size of your cohort, the size of your study team. Will you be graded as a group? Will you be graded individually? How long are you together with your cohort? Is it only for the first month? Is it for the first 6 months? Is it for 1 year? You know yourself best. Everyone's different. Some people thrive in huge classes and love that variety of people. Others like a more smaller, intimate experience. So these are good questions to ask.
Yeah. Actually, Darren, can I add an extra point just onto that?
Absolutely.
An additional point worth making is that, I've listed all these questions on my blog post, and one really important thing is that by going through and thinking about these questions, it means that you have a far greater understanding of why you want to go to that school. And I think that will then come through when you're talking in your essays or in your interview about the research and understanding you have of that school. And particularly talking about cohorts I think is a good example of where it would be very easy to slip up and show that you haven't done your research, because every school calls them something slightly different. At London Business School, it's called a stream. Other business schools, it might be called a section or a cohort. And if you're going into an interview, or again in your essay, and you're applying to London Business School and you're writing about cohorts and sections, yes, they're going to understand you, but you're also going to demonstrate that you haven't really done a thorough amount of research about London Business School. So by answering some of these questions, you can really show that you know the school that you're applying to very well.
No, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Candidates need to speak the language of the school. So at MIT, that is called an ocean, for example, your cohort. So if you're interviewing with MIT alum and you say, "Oh, this is, my section," I'm sure the alumni is like, "What has this person really, done his research?" So I think that's a great point. You're spending so much money and so much time on this MBA degree. It behooves you to know all this stuff anyways. And yes, it will definitely show through your application. I can say that as someone who has read thousands of applications. So what about bidding to actually go on exchange? Does everyone from LBS who wants to go to CIBS, are they able to go, or is there an application process? And how does that process work in terms of applying to exchange at other schools?
Oh, right, yeah. So I imagine every school has a slightly different process. Uh, the way it worked at LBS is that you put in your first, second, third preferences. And what they do is that I might have some of this wrong, but the way I remember it is that you write an essay about why you want to go to that school, what you can bring to it, what you can contribute, how you can play an ambassador of the school that you're coming from. Um, and I think that contributed for about two-thirds of the mark that they gave you, and then there would be one-third based on your first year grades, and they use that to decide. And then, so let's say I got 70 and someone else got 80, then that person would have the priority to go to the exchange school that we had chosen to. And this was one of the reasons why I applied to LBS, is that LBS has a fantastic range of exchange schools. So there's a number of great American business schools that you can go to, and there's also so many others from all around the world. And so my classmates were spending a semester abroad in Spain, South America. I went to Shanghai. Other classmates were in Hong Kong, Australia. I mean, you name it, and you would probably find LBS students on exchange there. And so that for me was a really exciting thing. I actually put Berkeley as a choice in front of Siebes,
Yep.
and I didn't actually get that. So yeah, you don't always get your first choice. And a lot of that also has to do with the number of places available. Not all, some schools have more places available than others, and obviously some schools have a greater demand than others as well. Berkeley was a very popular one. And unfortunately, I missed out. But you know what? I had a fantastic time over in China, and it meant that I could improve my Mandarin as well, and live somewhere where I wouldn't normally. It'd be very easy for me to go and live in the US. China is I guess a more challenging step to make. So I had a fantastic time there, and definitely don't regret it.
So you listeners can definitely see how nuanced this whole process is. So one, check to see if you're interested in exchange and international experience. See how many partner schools your school has. Second, James dropped a really good tip, which is you got to get good grades. And I think at most schools, in general, if you want to exchange at top schools, they want to see that you've performed well academically. The third is how many people can actually go to these different schools. Now, from the admission standpoint, from my standpoint, schools with bigger brand names like LBS will attract more incoming students, right? So maybe I'm a student at SMU or at Siebes. I really want to study at London. Where am I going to go? LBS is a huge name. So because London Business School gets a lot of incoming students, they can also afford to send more outgoing students. That's how exchanges work. So in general, the better known your school is, or if it's in a really good location like Shanghai, China, I think you would have more opportunities to exchange. But you can see there's a whole process to that. And these are great questions to ask alumni and students if this is something that's really important to you.
And it's not just about exchange as well. So, for instance, if you're at somewhere like INSEAD, you don't even need to go on exchange because you've got a second campus out in Singapore where you can go study. So that's another element to think about as well if you want to experience different parts of the world while doing your MBA.
Great point. Great point. And that ties on to my next question, which is two things you mentioned in your blog post. One that I thought was quite funny. Are there weekly drinks? And the second one, which is related to what we are just talking about, is what international treks are offered and will they break the bank?
Well, let's answer that first question first. And I can assure you that London Business School does have weekly drinks, and it's always a great time, and they're also free. And so I think this is something that can speak to the culture of a school as well. I think there are some schools, some MBA programs where you would have to pay your monthly or semester dues to be able to attend the drinks. And I'm sure most students do. But, maybe those little things come into it. Maybe you're the type of student who might not want to go along most of the time, but there'll be a couple of times where you do want to go along and join all along with all your classmates. Now, maybe if I was at a school where I had to pay dues to attend, now suddenly I'm someone who I only want to go once or twice, but now I'm not going to go and I'm not going to take part. When I was over at Siebes in Shanghai, they didn't have weekly drinks, and I think it would have been fantastic if they did, because it brings students together and it's a chance to meet new students, or it's also a chance just to catch up with people you haven't seen in quite some time. So I think it's an element that adds to the culture of the school and a way of bringing people together. So that's your first question. Second question about the treks. For me, I think the treks were one of the highlights of London Business School. And broadly, treks break down into two categories. You've got your social treks and your professional treks. And I guess for anyone who's not so familiar with the word trek, it's more really a trip where you go to some sort of destination and experience that place. So I went on a couple of professional treks. I went on one over to Los Angeles where we went and and we were there for an entire week. And we had meetings with all the kind of LA-based Hollywood companies. But we were meeting with Universal Studios, Disney, I think Ticketmaster, everyone who you think is associated with that Hollywood industry. We were meeting with them. And it was such a great way to understand the industry. And it can also lead to developing that network in case you want to apply for jobs there as well. And I went on another one up to San Francisco, and I loved that as well. So we were meeting with, again, Google, Dropbox, who else? We went to Tesla, and so we saw their factory there, and that was great,
cool.
kind of learning about what they were doing too. Yeah, so great opportunity to go and experience a different place and learn about what's happening in that particular industry, and also a great way just to network your way into jobs as well. So, for instance, there's I know investment treks where they go to Shanghai and to New York, and it really is very focused about getting focused on the job hunting thing. So that's the professional side. But then on the other hand, there's the fun side, and we had some fantastic treks where I think we probably had 80 people who went to Japan for an entire week, and I think another 80 people who went to Portugal for 4 days. So there's definitely some great opportunities there. And I went on one earlier this year to Greece, and we sailed around the Greek islands for a week as well. And of course, during this time, it's a great way to bond with your fellow classmates, meet new classmates who you hadn't previously met, and really just have a great time. Of course, the downside, I guess, it is a downside, is that all these trips cost money.
Yes.
And so, find out where you might like to go. You could also organize your own one to wherever you're from. I thought about trying to organize one to New Zealand. Although New Zealand, you tell people how expensive it is just for the flights there, and suddenly they become less excited about going. But, you think about it's an opportunity to show people your own country. And I know that really gets, most people excited. But yeah, think about how much you might need to save up for these. Talk to current students and find out how much these trips are costing them. They don't all need to be away to Japan or Los Angeles. We definitely had ones that were much closer. So from London over to France, or down to Portugal. So much easier, where you can hop on a cheap flight down there, and it's much more affordable than some places.
And so, were there any other extracurricular or club elements to LBS that you just, you had no idea existed when you applied, and that you wish you had asked about before?
Find out about which clubs are active. All MBA schools are looking for you to contribute to the culture and all the activities that are happening on campus. They don't want you just to come on and focus purely on on studying and finding jobs. That's definitely an important thing, but they're looking for you to add to the vibrancy of the place. And a key way that that occurs at business schools is through the clubs. And so find out which ones are active and which ones perhaps aren't. And I would say that most MBA schools, you can easily find that online or talk to current students as well. And again, clubs broadly break down into two different categories. You've got your professional ones, which are very focused on finding jobs. Maybe it's in consulting or technology. And then you've got your fun ones, and those are also a great thing to take part in. And so I was part of the London Business School Rugby Club, and I think I didn't really think about that so much before applying, but once I joined, I knew that this was a club that I needed to be part of. And it was such a great experience. Again, it's such a way to form long-lasting friendships. Playing sports, going on trips to play other teams, and enjoying drinks afterwards as well. Yeah, so think about which things you might like to try out. We had a photography club, we had salsa. So throw yourself at those, and that's the way you really get more out of business school. And then also think about the professional clubs as well as a way to work your way into the different industries as well. So for instance, I really got involved with the technology club. And so I organized a tech conference at London Business School where we had, I think, about 200 attendees. We had fantastic speakers. In my first year, we had the managing director for Spotify from the UK speaking. This year, we had the Twitter MD for the UK speaking. So I had some great speakers. And I think being involved in organizing that definitely helped me get into the tech world. And also, again, the treks come into this as well. So we had a trek to Silicon Valley. We had one over to Dublin as well. So the clubs can also be a great way not just to make friends, but also to find your next job.
That's awesome insight, and I'm sure many of our listeners never have thought about these questions, about clubs and how important they are and how integral they are to the student experience, the bonding experience, and the professional experience as well. And let's get to that. So probably the last section on jobs. Okay, so of course the big question in every MBA candidate's mind. What do you think are the most important questions to ask about business schools when people are doing research here?
So I guess there's a couple of questions you need to ask yourself. Is where do you want to work after the MBA? So for instance, I had been in London beforehand and thought London would be a fantastic place to stay on afterwards. And so that was an important driver in applying to London Business School. And so I would definitely say, think about where it is you want to work. If you're going to a West Coast school, it's much easier to find a job on the West Coast than it is if you're trying to find a job from London. Equally, if someone on the west coast of the US is trying to find a job in London, that's going to be very difficult unless you're from that area and you're returning to where you were previously. So yeah, think about where you want to live, and I imagine most people are thinking about that. But I think what you should also really be asking of current students and alumni is who are the recruiters, who are the companies that are coming and actually recruiting from those schools, and ask, like, well, how many people are being employed from Goldman Sachs? Goldman Sachs are recruiting how many people from London Business School versus INSEAD and BCG and McKinsey? Are they coming and recruiting? Chances are with kind of those type of companies, yeah, absolutely. They're going to be at all the top business schools. But what about let's go jump back into the tech industry. If you're Apple or Amazon, maybe you're only looking kind of on the West Coast and you're not so focused on the East Coast or other parts of the world. Let's take, say, Samsung, and you're thinking about wanting to work at Samsung in South Korea, then maybe you're better off thinking about doing an MBA somewhere Asia focused. Think about where you want to work afterwards and find out whether those companies are recruiting from those business schools.
Absolutely. I think so many candidates want to say do management consulting after going to business school, but they fail to even look at whether the management consulting firms they want to work at recruit from that school. I do think that the top management consultancies tend to recruit from a select group of schools. So you really need to do your career research there. Aside from seeing where you want to work, aside from looking at what companies are recruiting from the school and how many graduates they're recruiting, what questions would you advise our listeners to ask about career services at the school?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. So find out, does career services have insights or links into particular industries? And you probably don't need career services to make those introductions to those more well-established recruiters from the MBA program, like your McKinsey's or your Goldman Sachs. But if you're interested in, let's say, smaller, more niche companies, then that's where career services can be very useful in making introductions. Now, I wouldn't rely on career services completely. A lot of it is up to you to go and do your networking into those companies as well. But career services, a good career services can definitely be very useful.
And so, how did you get your job at PayPal?
I got it through networking. My old housemate was working or is working at PayPal, and I had been applying to a couple of different tech companies, and he suggested, well, James, why don't you apply to PayPal as well? And so he was able to put my CV forward to the managing director of PayPal here in the UK, and that led to me going in for an interview. Next thing I know, I had an internship there last summer, and that went from an internship to a full-time job. So yeah, it's not always about career services. A lot of it is about going out there and doing your own networking as well.
Awesome. Well, we've covered so much ground on this podcast. I think that anyone who listens to it will really have a lot of great questions to ask when they're researching schools. James, if we could close this podcast with one more question from me, which is, what is the ultimate question you have to answer to decide on a business school? So you decided on London Business School. So what do you think was the biggest factor there?
I think so. I think the biggest question you really have to ask yourself is, where is it that you want to go after doing the MBA, and will that business school provide the best opportunity for you to achieve that? And so, for instance, maybe London Business School is not the best place to get into the tech industry. Maybe Haas or Stanford would have been a better place to go. But perhaps linked into that is, think not just about what it is you want to do after the MBA, but where you want to be after the MBA as well. So it's those two questions. And if you can answer those two questions, then that will definitely point you in the right direction of which schools you should be looking at.
Awesome stuff, James. Thank you so much for joining us on the Touch MBA podcast.
It's been a pleasure being on the show, Darren. Very much appreciated it.